and civilians became central to any war-fighting effort. And then came nuclear weapons, and then we had the concept of the Cold War, which effectively was the beginning of what we now refer to as hybrid warfare, as if this is something very new. But in fact, it's not new. The tactics that were used during the Cold War, psi warfare, economic warfare, these are all what we now put under hybrid warfare, and some people, including some military analysts, get very excited as if now we are confronted with hybrid warfare and this is something new, so we must formulate. I beg to differ. Hybrid warfare has been here for a long time, and if we in Pakistan have been slow in catching up on what to do and how to deal with hybrid warfare, then it is a failing on our part, and people who analyze their fault, not that it's something new at all. So then I come to the issue of security, which was redefined within a holistic framework of economic security, security from fear, from hunger, from disease, all in terms of human security for all citizens. So this introduction, lest everybody thought I'm wandering away from domestic challenges, is to put a framework and how to view domestic challenges, because you can't just view them within society. You have to also take into consideration the external environment within which a state operates because of its geopolitical situation, especially its geography. So the challenges confronting a state in terms of formulating a holistic security policy, given the external environment, are how to meet the domestic compulsions within the framework of external challenges. For Pakistan, these linkages between the external and the internal are intricate, because Pakistan straddles West Asia and South Asia geographically, and both areas presently are facing security challenges. The Afghanistan war especially, and the hurried departure of NATO and the US has, of course, as we all know, created a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And that threatens a severe fallout on Pakistan in terms of terrorism and of a possible refugee influx. Pakistan already, as you know, is home to a huge population of Afghan refugees and is facing an increase in terrorism from its western borders. Unless stability is achieved in Afghanistan, an influx of the people from across the many border crossings with Pakistan will add to both the socio-economic pressures on Pakistan, especially in the volatile merged areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in Balochistan, and to the internal security issue of terrorism. So hence Pakistan's declared priority policy of seeking to stabilize Afghanistan through seeking global support to deal with the humanitarian crisis, and of seeking the TTA government's support in denying TTP and other terrorist groups that are seeking havens in Afghanistan. These are our priorities, and rightly so. Pakistan also faces the challenge of terrorist groups seeking shelter along the Pak-Afghan border. There is also the challenge of how to continue allowing the facilitation of electricity, power, and other facilities that are available to Pakistani citizens along the Pakistan-Afghan border areas of Balochistan to continue, which in a way acts as a deterrence to large-scale smuggling, which has a direct negative bearing on our economy. But we have to balance that by seeking to avoid coming under the axe of US sanctions against Iran. Opening up of border markets has been one effective measure that our government has now put in place. On the Eastern Front, the present Indian government's continuing efforts to up the military ante, especially along the LOC, means dealing with an ongoing external security challenge. So to sum up, externally, Pakistan confronts an unstable environment that prevents regional cooperation in the economic and trade issue areas, which could have allowed all the regional countries the benefits of regional economies of scale and free trade. What the business community in Pakistan, as elsewhere, which is motivated primarily by the profit motive, fails to understand is that one can hardly have trade with a neighbor like India that is not only conducting war crimes in illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but targeting its own Muslim citizens, especially women, and holding the threat of false flag operations against Pakistan ad nauseum. So unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, the economic potential of regional trade eastward with India for Pakistan remains unlikely, despite the common challenges of poverty, food security, migration, and human trafficking confronting both Pakistan and India. However, expansion of trade, a major factor in improving the economy and the living standards of the people, westwards through Iran and into Turkey, as well as into Central Asia, into Central Asian states, is now being operationalized by Pakistan. The transport infrastructure challenges also need to be dealt with if this trade potential is to be fully realized. In fact, in terms of trade and exports, the government has realized the need to move beyond red tapeism and truly implement ease of doing business frameworks. One major benefit of trade access to the EU is, of course, through the GSP+, and this has been linked to implementation of human rights conventions by Pakistan, which Pakistan is already a signatory to. The challenges confronting ordinary Pakistanis in terms of their basic human rights are being addressed through bringing Pakistan's laws in conformity with the commitments made in these international human rights conventions. To this end, we have passed landmark legislation, including the ICT Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2020, the Legal Aid and Justice Authority Act 2020, the Zainab Alert Response and Recovery Act 2020, the amendment that we have made in the schedule of the Employment of Children's Act 1991, which now bans child domestic labor in the Capital Federal Territory, the Protection of Journalists and Media Professionals Act 2021, and the recently passed very revolutionary, in my view, Protection Against Harassment of Women in the Workplace Amendment Act 2022. But two outstanding issues remain in fulfilling our international commitments and in improving and providing justice and security for the people of Pakistan, the ordinary citizens, which is one of the big domestic challenges. And those two issues that remain unfulfilled, but we are in the process of fulfilling them, are of course our anti-torture bill and criminalization of enforced disappearances, a bill that was passed by the National Assembly and is taking a long time to appear in the Senate, but hopefully it will appear. The pandemic again presents serious challenges to governments across the world, and we saw some devastating effects in our own neighborhood, especially in India, as well as in many developed states. Pakistan's approach to the pandemic was primarily guided by a human rights perspective, focusing on the well-being of its people. And it focused on the most vulnerable groups which faced compounded risks as a result of the pandemic. We addressed domestic violence by running nationwide campaigns and embedding special codes in our helpline so that victims could report in the presence of perpetrators because of the smart lockdowns when the harasser and the harassed were stuck in the same household or wherever. The approach of the NCOC and the coordinated effort of the government ensured that the risk to those living below the poverty line was minimized through smart lockdowns and the Asas Emergency Cash Program. But even if there had been no pandemic and no external instability, Pakistan, like many of its neighbors, confronted a host of domestic challenges concerning the rights of women, children, transgenders, and minorities. So consequently, the government prioritized legislative reform, flagship initiatives, and institutional reforms for these groups, because these are domestic challenges that, if they're not addressed, weaken a society internally, create polarization, and therefore they weaken the state in terms of its overall security. In many human rights priority areas, in fact, Pakistan has gone above and beyond its neighbors to protect fundamental rights. As far as the rights of the transgender persons are concerned, Pakistan has passed legislation that many developed Western countries also don't have at the moment, especially the option to choose one's own gender on identity documents and receive protection from discrimination. Pakistan is one of the few countries that has a provision in its ID cards and its passport for transgenders separately. And in fact, I wrote a letter to the EU saying that I was surprised, since they call themselves the upholders of human rights, why they have not taken this action so far. So on some things, we are moving ahead. Last year, we established a protection center for transgenders, offering rehabilitation, referral, and legal assistance for transgenders at risk. The problem that we have seen is not that we have made more laws and we are trying to provide social nets and so on. The problem that we still confront, and this is a big problem domestically, a big challenge, as one may say, is changing mindsets of people. Laws come into play when the crime is committed. But the problem, especially with child abuse, with gender violence, is why do these crimes get committed in the first place? Society has an equal responsibility. We have, of course, done awareness programs and so on, but unless people's mindsets change, we will be confronting these problems in our society. With the global economic recession, global inflation, rising fuel prices, etc., countries like ours that confront poverty, confront aggravation of these issues relating to unemployment, spiraling food prices at home, and especially the increasing vulnerabilities of the marginalized populations and minorities. To make matters worse, we have been seeing since 9/11 a growing shift to the right across the globe, and increasing polarization and extremism. Terrorism has further accentuated these issues. We are seeing a rise of Islamophobia, including in our own region in India. Pakistan is also faced with the threat of militant extremism alongside a resurgence in terrorism, especially with the instability in Afghanistan. Splinter TTP groups without any centralized control have now become a serious threat, which has to be dealt with cohesively. The extremist mindset again poses a domestic challenge to countries in our region. But regional dialogue on this sensitive issue, unfortunately, is not a possibility given the belligerent Indian government and the still unstable TTA government in Kabul. Pakistan has to therefore meet this challenge on its own, even though external influences have a direct impact in aggravating the problem. Overall, traditional domestic challenges like poverty have now expanded to include challenges of terrorism and extremism, which have direct external linkages, but unfortunately, no regional mechanism to deal with these challenges. Pakistan has moved to deal with the traditional challenges of human security, as I've pointed out, by also beginning to build a social welfare network and framework for the first time, including a healthcare system based on quality-free healthcare for all its citizens. The issue of extremism and terrorism still requires a more cohesive approach. A beginning was made with a NAP that was formed after the National Action Plan that was formed after the APS tragedy. But unfortunately, that NAP was really napping all along. It lay dormant. And only now is being revived. Criminal law reforms, which should have taken place in the previous government because that was part of the NAP requirement, have now finally been not implemented but drafted, and there is now a cohesive criminal law reform bill that is ready to be placed in Parliament, where for the first time all the criminal laws that exist in Pakistan, especially those from British times, which were never revised or renewed or updated, have all now been updated in a more cohesive manner, and especially taking into fact that we are now an independent democratic state, not a colonial power, not a colony. Criminal law reforms, therefore, have become very critical because if we are going to provide justice, which is a big challenge to all our people, at little cost and should not be time consuming, then you need to review and revise and reform the criminal laws and the way that the criminal system functions at the moment. But more needs to be done. And regional cooperation would facilitate the fight against terrorism also. But when regional states like India are themselves the instigators of terrorism in neighboring states, then cooperation is not an option. Human security at the end of the day is indivisible, but as long as conflict remains unresolved, our countries will remain vulnerable to threats to human security. And at the moment, we can meet the challenges within our domestic framework, but we need to realize that there are limitations because a number of these challenges are interdependent globally and regionally. So we have to also move towards finding some form of regional cooperative frameworks and the beginning has to be made, of course, with conflict resolution. Existence of conflict and human security do not go hand in hand. Till conflicts end, the ordinary people in countries which are subject to conflicts will never be able to get the sort of human security that is critical to any well-developed, egalitarian, and democratic society. Thank you very much.